Picture this. A man who could demolish opponents with the force of a sledgehammer, a heavyweight champion who struck terror into the hearts of boxing legends, sitting alone in his dressing room, hands trembling not from exhaustion, but from something far more profound. George Foreman, the most feared puncher in boxing history, was about to face the one man who made him question everything he believed about himself. This isn't just another boxing story. This is about the raw, unfiltered truth of what it means to face your deepest fears when the whole world is watching. Before we continue, this channel exists because of you. If this beginning moved you, subscribe now. It's quick, easy, and makes all the difference to me. The year was 1974, and George Foreman was unstoppable. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighing 220 pounds of pure destruction, he had demolished Joe Frazier and Ken Norton in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Frazier, the man who had broken Muhammad Ali's undefeated record, was knocked down 6 times in 2 rounds. Norton, who had broken Ali's jaw, was flattened in the 2nd round. These weren't just victories. They were statements written in blood and sweat on the canvas of professional boxing. But there was something eating away at George Foreman's confidence, something that kept him awake at night in his Houston home. It wasn't Ali's physical prowess that haunted him, though the former champion's speed and footwork were legendary. It wasn't even Ali's knockout power, which, while respectable, paled in comparison to Foreman's sledgehammer fists. No, what terrified George Foreman was something far more insidious, something that struck at the very core of his identity as a fighter and as a man. Muhammad Ali possessed a weapon that George Foreman had never learned to defend against, the ability to get inside his opponent's head and plant seeds of doubt that would grow like weeds until they choked out every ounce of confidence. Ali didn't just fight with his hands. He fought with words, with presence, with an almost mystical ability to transform himself from underdog to inevitable victor through sheer force of personality and psychological warfare. Foreman had witnessed this phenomenon firsthand when he watched Ali's fights from ringside. He had seen how Ali could take opponents who were physically superior and reduce them to confused, frustrated shells of themselves. It wasn't magic, though it often seemed that way. It was pure psychology, applied with surgical precision by a master who understood that boxing was as much a mental game as it was physical. The fear began to manifest in subtle ways. Foreman found himself watching Ali's old fights obsessively, analyzing every movement, every taunt, every psychological manipulation. He would sit in his training camp in Marshall, Texas, surrounded by yes-men and sparring partners who told him what he wanted to hear. But deep down, he knew something was different about this upcoming fight in Zaire. During training sessions, Foreman's usually dominant presence seemed slightly diminished. His sparring partners noticed it first, the way he would sometimes hesitate before throwing combinations that had previously flowed like water. His trainer, Dick Sadler, could see it in Foreman's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that had never been there before. The psychological warfare had already begun, even though the fighters hadn't yet arrived in Africa. Ali's pronouncements reached Foreman through television interviews and newspaper articles. "George Foreman is nothing but a big, slow, clumsy giant," Ali declared to reporters. "He hits hard, but he can't hit what he can't catch. I'm going to dance around him like he's a statue in the park." But it wasn't just the words themselves that unsettled Foreman. It was the confidence behind them. Ali spoke as if the outcome was already decided, as if he possessed some secret knowledge about how the fight would unfold. This wasn't typical pre-fight bravado. This was something deeper, more unsettling. Foreman's fear wasn't the kind that makes a man cower or retreat. It was the fear of a proud warrior who sensed that his invincibility might be an illusion, that his identity as the most feared man in boxing might crumble under the bright lights of Kinshasa. He had built his reputation on raw power and intimidation, but Ali represented something that power alone couldn't overcome: pure, unadulterated psychological dominance. The airplane journey to Zaire felt longer than usual for Foreman. While his entourage chatted excitedly about the upcoming payday and the exotic location, George stared out the window, lost in thoughts that he couldn't share with anyone. How do you tell people that you're afraid of a man who hasn't won a heavyweight title fight in over 3 years? How do you explain that your fear isn't of physical harm, but of being exposed as somehow less than what everyone believes you to be? When they landed in Kinshasa, the contrast between the two camps became immediately apparent. Ali's arrival was a celebration. Thousands of Zairians chanted his name, treating him like a returning hero rather than a foreign fighter. Children followed his car through the dusty streets, singing songs that incorporated his name. It was as if the entire country had already chosen its champion. Foreman's reception was polite, but notably cooler. The local population respected his power and his championship status, but there was no emotional connection, no sense that they were witnessing the arrival of their chosen warrior. This psychological disadvantage weighed heavily on Foreman's mind as he settled into his training camp. The training camps themselves told the story of two completely different approaches to the upcoming fight. Ali's camp buzzed with energy and confidence. He trained in the open air, surrounded by local children and admirers who cheered his every movement. His workouts became performances, complete with commentary about how he would defeat the big, ugly bear from America. Foreman's camp, by contrast, was more isolated and businesslike. He trained with methodical intensity, pounding heavy bags with devastating combinations that echoed through the African air like thunder. But even his most impressive displays of power seemed somehow defensive, as if he were trying to convince himself rather than intimidate his opponent. The psychological pressure intensified as fight week approached. Ali's daily press conferences became must-see theatre, with the former champion delivering increasingly creative insults and predictions. He would mime Foreman's supposedly slow, plodding fighting style, exaggerating his movements for comedic effect while predicting that the champion would fall like a tree when hit with Ali's combinations. Each of these performances chipped away at Foreman's psychological armor. He found himself responding to Ali's taunts in ways that revealed his growing frustration. During his own press conferences, Foreman's usual stoic demeanor gave way to visible irritation when reporters asked him to respond to Ali's latest pronouncements. "All that talking doesn't mean anything when the bell rings," Foreman would say, but even his supporters could hear the slight edge in his voice, the way his jaw tightened when Ali's name was mentioned. The mind games were working, and everyone in Zaire could sense it. The night before the fight, Foreman lay in his hotel bed, staring at the ceiling fan that turned slowly in the humid African air. He tried to visualize the fight, to imagine himself landing the devastating right hand that had ended so many careers. But every time he tried to picture Ali falling, his imagination would conjure images of the former champion slipping away, dancing out of range, making him look foolish in front of 80,000 screaming fans and millions of television viewers worldwide. This was the fear that George Foreman had never admitted to anyone. Not the fear of losing, but the fear of being made to look like a fool. Ali had the ability to make even the most accomplished fighters appear clumsy and confused. He had done it to Sonny Liston, to Floyd Patterson, to countless others who had entered the ring confident in their abilities, only to leave defeated and diminished. Foreman understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Ali's true power lay not in his physical gifts, though they were considerable, but in his ability to transform a boxing match into a psychological referendum on his opponent's worthiness. Ali didn't just want to win fights. He wanted to prove that his opponents were fundamentally inferior beings who had been exposed as frauds when faced with true greatness. The morning of October 30th, 1974, arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes everything feel surreal and dreamlike. Foreman went through his pre-fight routine with mechanical precision, but those closest to him could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched when he thought no one was looking. In the final hours before the fight, as Foreman sat in his dressing room, having his hands wrapped, he finally understood the full scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a boxing match. It was a battle for his very identity as a fighter and as a man. Ali had already won the psychological war before they ever stepped into the ring, and Foreman knew it. The fear that consumed George Foreman wasn't rational or easily explained. It was the fear of a man who had always relied on intimidation, suddenly facing someone who seemed completely immune to intimidation. It was the fear of discovering that everything he believed about himself might be wrong. As the call came for fighters to make their way to the ring, Foreman stood up slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows in the fluorescent light of the dressing room. He had spent weeks trying to convince himself that Ali was just another opponent, just another man who would fall to his devastating power. But deep down he knew better. The walk to the ring felt like a funeral procession. The crowd's energy was electric, but it wasn't for him. 80,000 voices chanted Ali's name, creating a wall of sound that seemed to push Foreman backward with each step. This was Ali's crowd, Ali's moment, Ali's coronation. Standing in his corner, waiting for the opening bell, George Foreman experienced something he had never felt before in a boxing ring. The absolute certainty that he was about to participate in his own destruction. Not physical destruction, though that was possible, but something far worse. The destruction of the myth that had sustained him throughout his career. The bell rang, and for 8 rounds, Foreman's worst fears played out in front of the watching world. Ali absorbed his best shots, mocked his efforts, and gradually wore him down through a combination of physical punishment and psychological warfare that was unlike anything Foreman had ever experienced. When Foreman finally fell in the 8th round, knocked out by a combination that seemed almost gentle compared to the sledgehammer blows he had been throwing all night, it wasn't just his body that hit the canvas. It was the end of an era. The end of an identity that had defined him for years. The aftermath was perhaps the most revealing part of the entire experience. As Foreman sat in his dressing room after the fight, still groggy from the knockout, he felt something unexpected. Relief. The fear that had consumed him for months was gone, replaced by a strange sense of freedom. Years later, Foreman would admit that his fear of Muhammad Ali had nothing to do with physical intimidation, and everything to do with the recognition that he was facing a force of nature that operated by completely different rules. Ali didn't just fight. He transformed boxing matches into epic narratives where he was always the hero, and his opponents were always the villains destined to fall. The real revelation came in the months following the fight, as Foreman began the long process of rebuilding his career and his identity. He realized that his fear of Ali had been in many ways a fear of his own limitations. Ali had forced him to confront the possibility that being the hardest puncher in the world might not be enough, that there were dimensions to combat that he had never fully understood or explored. This understanding would eventually transform Foreman from a one-dimensional puncher into a more complete fighter, and ultimately into one of the most beloved figures in sports. But in 1974, sitting in that dressing room in Kinshasa, all he felt was the profound relief that comes from surviving an encounter with something that had seemed for months like an unstoppable force. The fear that George Foreman felt toward Muhammad Ali was never really about boxing. It was about the recognition that some people possess a kind of power that transcends physical ability, a power to transform reality through sheer force of will and personality. Ali had that power in abundance, and Foreman had sensed it long before they ever stepped into the ring together. In the end, Foreman's fear proved to be well-founded. Ali didn't just defeat him, he exposed him, changed him, and ultimately helped him become a better fighter and a more complete human being. Sometimes the things we fear most are the things we most need to face. If you made it this far and felt every word, don't leave without subscribing and commenting where you're watching me from. If this truly touched you, give back, comment, subscribe. Come be part of this family with me until the next video.